We're both like today's daf is daf Yud Beis. We're going to start on daf Yud Aleph Amid Beis. On daf Yud Aleph Amid Beis, you'll see the wide lines on the bottom. If you count down from the beginning of the wide lines, it's about 7 lines down. Or alternatively, if you count up from the bottom of the Amud, it's approximately 10 lines up, a little bit less maybe. You'll see the 2 dots, Zeh HaKlal. And the Gemara quotes a part of a Mishnah, which is very important for us today. So our subject for today is what qualifies as schach. And the Mishnah establishes 2 conditions. Number 1, it has to be something that's gidulo min haaretz, it grows from the ground. And number 2, it's got to be something that's not makabel tumah. Now, at the face of it, there's a contradiction here, because if it's something that grows from the ground, that's usually food, like vegetables or fruits. And that which grows from the ground is called the ochlin, and ochlin are makabel tumah. That's just the fact on the ground. We can't deny that. So how do you get a case of something that's gidula min haaretz, but it's not makabel tumah? It have to be something like leaves or straw, things that grow from the ground, but yet are not fruits. They're not edible, and therefore they're not makabel tumah. Srak, you learn srak. So the Gemara asks me, Nahani Mili. And that's going to be the subject of our discussion for today. What is the source in the Torah from which we derive the conclusion that in order for something to qualify as schach, it has to fulfill 2 conditions? It's not makabel tumah, and it's gidulo min haaretz. Reish Lakish. Now, let me just give a little introduction to Reish Lakish. He's based on a principle which is called schach zecher la'anane hakavod. And the key word here is ananim, clouds. And Reish Lakish is going to go back to the beginning of the story of creation to figure out what is unique about clouds. We're going to get 2 qualities that describe clouds. And those 2 qualities are going to teach us what a sukkah is all about, because the schach of a sukkah has to be zecher la'anane hakavod. Amar Reish Lakish, Amar Kra, the Torah with regard to the creation of man. It describes in the 2nd chapter of Genesis, it says, V'ed yala min haaretz. And we're talking about anonim, we're talking about clouds, otherwise known in English as a mist, M-I-S-T. Now, clouds are understood, I'm not an expert in this, so, we need a scientist here, but cloud formation is usually a result of water and a certain condensation of water, and light reflects off water, whatever it is. But Reish Lakish has a chiddush based on the Torah that the water up in Shamayim, from which the clouds form, comes actually from the ground. It's what you would call, perhaps we could call it, looking for, what do you call it when water, evaporation, is that the word you used, Sarah? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you, I apologize. Anyway, we're talking about evaporated water that somehow, through the process of evaporation, it goes up to Shamayim, then the clouds are formed. So therefore, says Reish Lakish, ma'ed is another word for a cloud. Number 1, it's a davar she'eino makabel tumah, and this is based on the fact that, as Rashi points out here, tumah only applies to one of the following categories. Either it's kelim, or it's ochlin, or it's mashkim, or it's adam. And clouds don't fit into any of those 4 categories. And therefore, by process of elimination, literally elimination, they are not makabel tumah. And number 2, v'gidulo min haaretz. And that's what we said, that the water evaporates from the ground. There's water in the ground, and it evaporates. And then it goes up to the heavens, up to the skies, and then clouds are formed.
Really comes off the ocean. Like, the water that...
Okay, that's Reish Lakish. Again, there could be 5 other shittas, so you can always align yourself with any of the other 5. But Reish Lakish is of the opinion that the pasuk emphasizes aretz. You see the pasuk, it says, "V'eid ya'ale min ha'aretz." The cloud comes up from the ground. Now, I was just trying to add a little bit of science here with my limited understanding of science. How could it be that the cloud comes up from the ground? Have you ever seen a cloud come up from the ground? But the Torah says that the cloud comes up from the ground. So that's where I gave you the evaporation theory, which I got from good old Google.
That line?
No, the Eid Yalavina Aretz is a quote from Breshit, from the story of creation. I didn't write that. Yeah. That's in Breshit bit. Is af sukkah, because sukkah again is a replacement of a cloud. It's zeichel anani akavod. Davar she'ena mekabel tu v'gidul of an aretz. So our two conditions for schach are derived clearly from this pasuk. Reish Lakish is very comfortable with this. But the Gemara says, "Hanichol aman dior anani akavod oyul aman dior l'sukas mamish asleim mai ikol meimar." There's a gigantic division of opinion as to what the schach is all about. This Sanya we learned in the Brisa. And now the Bryce is going to record a machlokas about what schach is all about. It says in the Torah, "Ki basukos al shavti es bnei Yisrael b'tzios b'tzi'i osam me'eretz Mitzrayim." And we sat in Sukkos after we left Mitzrayim for 40 years. And now we start with the Shita of Rabbi Eliezer. Anane kavod hoyu. When the Torah says that God placed us under these sukkos were the Anani HaKavod, the clouds of glory that protected us. Chazal speak about the fact that the enemies during the 40 years would send missiles, like ballistic missiles, and the Anani HaKavod would catch those missiles. And that's the zeicha that we have to make, according to Rabbi Eliezer, in the schach. And then it makes sense that the schach is really an anan. If it's an anan, then we derive those two conditions. But Rabbi Akiva disagrees. Rabbi Akiva over Sukkos mamish asu. Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Akiva ma'iklamim. According to the Shita of Rabbi Akiva, and by the way, in other sources, both in Shas and in Midrashim, the Shitos are the opposite. It's Rabbi Akiva who said Zeichel Anani Yaakov. But our Gemara has the tradition that it was Rabbi Akiva who held Sukkos mamish, and those are booths that the Jewish people built in the desert during the 40 years to protect themselves from the hot sun, etc. And you know that one of the commentaries on the Torah from the family of Rashi is called the Rashbam. Rashbam tries to figure out why would we make a zecher to Sukkos mamish, according to this quoted Rabbi Akiva. There's nothing miraculous about it. So he tells us, very interesting Rashbam, that the concept of Sukkos mamish, this is brand new to me. That's why I'm excited about sharing it with you. I never understood Sukkos mamish. Like, what's the point? I mean, mamish is good if you're a Lubavitcher, you know, Menachem Etel Schneerson, but what's Sukkos mamish? What's that all about? So the Rashbam says the following, fascinating, that Sukkos is all about Shevach V'Odoyah. It's the fact that we have to appreciate what God gave us. And when we appreciate our homes, because God allows us to live in homes that protect us, we go back into the sukkah or out into the sukkah, and that sukkah are the booths that we were able to live in for 40 years. I mean, they were very flimsy booths, but yet we survived for 40 years. And that's supposed to generate within us a sense of Hakaras HaTov.
It seems that do it proper and feeling stuck because, like you said, we're protected on all sides. We're protected on all the wall, and especially if it's coming up from the ground, coming up the walls.
Well, we understand that the walls are there just to hold up the schach. Why? Because the Torah used the word basukos teishu shivas yom. And the word sukos comes from the shoresh schach. So that the protection from the sun, what we call shade, which is going to be the main issue for today, that is what we're commemorating when we go out to the sukkah. Because although, again, the tefanos and the walls of the sukkah protect us from many different ways, but the main protection for which we are commanded to commemorate this sukkah is the schach itself. Sukkah miloshin schach. Yasser Rav Dimi, Rav Yochanan. Now, you'll know that there were two Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva who constantly, this was their job in the tradition of the Masorah of Torah. They brought the Masorah of Rabbi Yochanan from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel. One of them was Rav Dimi, the other was Ravin. Rav Dimi says in the name of Yochanan, Amar Kra, I have a different source from which I derive these two conditions in Schach. And that is a hekesh between Chag, emphasize the word Chag, and the word Chag that appears in a different parsha, which is the parsha of Chagiga. And as you know, when we went up on Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael to bring the Korban Chagiga came from a behema, and Makish Sukkah Chagiga. The use of the term Chag with regard to Sukkahs is indicating that just like Chagiga has to come from a behema, and we'll see two qualities of a behema, so too Sukkahs has to be a celebration with a behema. Not exactly a behema, nobody puts an animal on top of the schach, although I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But Makish Sukkah Chagiga, Ma Chagiga, Dover Sheni Makabel Tumah V'Gidula Min Haaretz, Af Sukkah Dover Makabel Tumah V'Gidula Min Haaretz. What is a behema? A behema is not Makabel Tumah, because as we said before, there are four categories of objects that are Makabel Tumah. Behema is not on the list. So number one, what we're going to derive from Chagiga is that the schach is a Dover She'eino Makabel Tumah like a behema. Number two, behema is Gidula Min Haaretz. Now, when was the last time you saw an animal that grew from the ground? I never saw such a thing. So Rashi explains that the animal sustains itself by eating that which grows from the ground. And that makes it Gidula Min Haaretz. Now, who would even imagine putting an animal on top of your roof as a sukkah, as a schach? Excellent. So that's what he says, and he says that you could imagine now, oros behema, the hides of an animal actually are makabel tumah, but mechusarim adayin ibud. Before you do the tanning, which is called ibud, which is one of the 39 blocks of Shabbos, then it's not makabel tumah, because for something to be makabel tumah, it's not enough that it's in its raw state as raw material. It has to be a finished product. However, we don't have such a minute. We don't allow animal hides as schach, although it would seem that technically it could. So the answer to this problem is that the Gemara, at the end of the day, does not accept this tradition in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. And that's what we're going to learn today, why the Gemara rejects Rabbi Yochanan. Take a look on Daf Yud Beis, which is our Daf for today.
Does that mean that he actually put animal hides on the sukkah?
I would assume that according to Rav Dimi, he probably did. But the Gemara rejects Rav Dimi. Rabbi Yochanan never said. We're going to have another tradition. Remember, I told you there were two students, primary disciples of Rabbi Yochanan. The other one was Ravin. And you'll see that Ravin is going to bring a tradition from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, the name of his Rebbe, Rabbi Yochanan, that the Gemara is much more comfortable. Because the Gemara rejects it. We cannot possibly use this hekesh as a valid hekesh, because if you're going to equate sukkah and schach with chag, meaning chagiga, then the most natural conclusion that you would get from that, derived from this hekesh, is that you would need a living animal for schach. And that is not something that we accept. We're not going to derive the conclusion that we use a living animal. And now we're back to square one. According to Rabbi Akiva, who holds that sukkos means sukkos mamish, then we still don't have a source for deriving the conclusion that sukkah and schach has to be davar gedulim in aris ve'ena mekabeltum. Ki also Ravin on Rabbi Yochanan. Ravin had a different tradition in the name of Rabbi Yochanan when he came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel. Omar Kra, the pasuk says in Parsha Asrei. I'll read the entire pasuk to you. Chag Sukkos tasel lecha shivas yomim bi'aspecha migarnacha umiyikvecha. Now the word aspecha, as we'll soon see, is a crucial word here. It means when you collect, and you're collecting from garnacha. Garnacha, in the Hebrew, he says, makom She osvim goren. And what is goren? He says goren hainu kash. It's husks or straw. So they do a process called threshing, and they take the natural grains, and after they thresh them, they remove the kernel, and what they're left with is husks and straw. And that's called teven v'kach. And that's called psoles goren, because again, v'yospecha means what you collect from the floor after you do the threshing. So the purpose of the threshing is to remove what? The kernel, because it's the kernel that you want. But what's left on the threshing floor after the process of threshing is husks and straws. And a similar thing goes on in yikvecha, right? Yikvecha is what we call in English a wine press. And after they press the wine, they remove the wine. But what's left on the floor of the wine press are what's called zmoros va'eshkolos reikim me'anovim, which I would translate as vines. You remember the vine itself? You know, we don't throw out anything. Like when I was a kid, we never threw out the yahrzeit glasses. We would just reuse them. I'm really dating myself. So we don't throw out the vine. So after you remove all the grapes from the vine, you want to use the vine for something. And we're going to use it for schach. And what else are we left with? We're left with those clusters. You know, they call eshkolot. And after you remove the olives, what you're left with is eshkolot. We don't want to throw out those eshkolot. So we found the use for them. We put them on top of our sukkah. Now, what's unique about both garnacha and yikvecha, which means soles garan v'yekev? These are items which, number one, grow from the ground, and number two, they're not makabel tumah because they're not edible. Anything that's not edible is not makabel tumah. So the Gemara has to be ema, perhaps goren atzmo. Maybe the Torah is not referring to what's left after you do the threshing on the floor, but what you take from the threshing. And what do you take from the threshing? The kernels themselves, the chita, the wheat, or the yekev atzmo. It means the olives. Well, I shouldn't say olives, I should say grapes. Sorry. On Rab Zera says, yekev ksiv kan, the efshal esachikba. Rabbi Zera thinks he found a technical answer to this problem. It cannot be that the word yekev, which means a wine press, is referring to the grapes themselves, because the grapes were pressed. And what you're left with after you press grapes is what? Wine. You can't put wine on top of the sukkah. It's just going to drip through. Be an interesting idea, by the way. I can, see people coming into my sukkah and collecting the wine as it drips through my schach. Again, but right now the Gemara is attacking this limud of Rabbi Yochanan because the Gemara is saying it's not the leftovers. It's what you actually brought in to the yekev in order to press and make the wine. So what you did was you pressed the grapes and you're left with wine. The Gemara says, Maskif le Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah is not happy with Rabbi Zera's technical answer to this question. The Ema, yayin karush. I could actually put yayin up on my schach. So guys, this is going to be my quiz question for you. I'm going to wake you up in the middle of the night a month from now, see if you remember this Gemara. How could you possibly use wine for schach? And the answer is yayin karush habami snir. Snir is the name of the place. They used to take te'enim, which are figs, and they used to pound them into round things, and they were, pulverized, so to speak. And you could have wine that's pulverized. It's called yayin karush. It's dry wine, but not dry wine the way we use the term dry wine, but dry wine that's solidified. Now, the only problem with dry wine that's solidified is that it seems from a sugya elsewhere in Masechet Tyrus, Paragimel, that dry wine that's solidified is actually makabel tumah. So how could the Gemara even suggest this? So that's a real problem that we have to raise if we're learning Tyrus. Oh, Rav Zera, we thought that we had a very good derivation for this requirement of Davar Makabel to of Davar Sheni Makabel to Gedulim and Oretz from the Pasuk V'Yaspecha Migarcha Umikfech until Rabbi Yirmiyah came along and he cut it down with an axe, which is an idiomatic phrase, which means he gave a tshuva nitzachas. He gave a final upshot. Rav Ashi says, no, I am going to defend Rabbi Yochanan according to the tradition of Ravin against the slings and arrows of Rabbi Yirmiyah. How so? Emphasize the word bi'aspecha. Remember, Rabbi Osai told you at the outset we should be underlining the word bi'aspecha. It says bi'aspecha mi garnecha. And what does bi'aspecha mean? Bi'aspecha means that which you collect from the floor of the garan, right? We said the garan was the threshing floor. After you do the threshing, what's left on the floor? Not that which you take, namely the kernels of wheat, but rather that which is left on the floor. Below garan atzmo, not the wheat itself. Mi'ikvecha means that which is left on the floor of the wine press, not the wine itself. Below yekev atzmo. Again, just to summarize, we have this drasha, this derivation of Rabbi Yochanan according to the tradition of Ravin from the pasuk in Parshas Re'eh. It says Psoles Goren v'Yekev, and Psoles Goren v'Yekev, which are left on the floor of the threshing floor or on the wine press, those kinds of husks and straws and empty clusters or vines, all of those are, number one, gedulim in haaretz, but enam mekablim tumah. Now the Gemara offers another possible source from which we derive these two conditions in Succah, Rav Chisda Me'Hocha. And now he's quoting a pasuk in Nehemiah. And the article here gives in footnote number 10 a little bit of background to what Nehemiah is going to talk to us about. Let me just read to you. He says in Nehemiah, the 8th chapter, the prophet Nehemiah commands the Jewish people to gather what they would need for the upcoming Sukkot festival, including materials for the covering of their sukkahs. Listed here are only items that are not susceptible to tumah and that grow from the ground. That's a summary of Rashi. And what?
But if you have a fruit tree, take off fruit, all the wood, the bark on the fruit tree, does that qualify as well?
Yeah, that would be great because it's not an ochel, it's not edible, it's not a fruit, and that grows from the ground, and it's not makabel tumah unless again you process it. We're talking about unprocessed bark. So the Gemara says, "Tzeu," this is a pasuk in Nehemiah. Very strange. I don't want to get sidetracked here, but if you take a look at Rashi, he says it's a pasuk in Ezra. That's a boo. It's not in Ezra. It's in Nehemiah. Apparently, Rashi considered Ezra and Nehemiah as one book. Okay, but that's not for us. Okay, that's for Rabbi Steinsaltz. I'm sure would have a paragraph about that. Nothing against it. I'm not trying to be facetious. I'm just saying, birds aren't to do what birds aren't to do.
I see Ezra and Nehemiah, they come together.
They do, but it's only Rashi. Rashi's the only Rishon that sees them as one sefer. I mean, we calculate 24 Sfarim in the Holy Writ. According to Rashi, there are only 23. Anyway, so Uhahar, go out to the mountains. V'aviu elai zayis, v'alei eitz shemen, v'alei hadas, v'alei tmarim, v'alei eitz avot, slasos sukkot is the end of the pasuk. And now Nehemiah is instructing us what to bring for Succah. And everything that's mentioned in the pasuk is number one, Eino Makabel Tumah, number two, it's Gidulim in Aretz. And we're going to derive from Nehemiah that this is the qualification required for valid Succah. Now the Gemara goes on a little bit of a tangent here, the next line or two in the Gemara. And the Gemara analyzes the pasuk. If you take a look at the pasuk, it says, Heviu alai, etc., etc. It says, Alei Hadas. And then at the end of the pasuk on this list, he's got alei eitz avos. Now, the Gemara at the end of Masechet Sukkah, we're really fast forwarding, when it addresses the sugya of the Daled Minim, the Gemara tells us that the phrase eitz avos, that biblical phrase, is a reference to a myrtle twig, which a myrtle leaf, which is hadas. And that's problematic here because he's got alei hadas, and then he's got alei eitz avos. So the Gemara immediately raises the objection, Hainu hadas, Hainu eitz avos. How could Nehemiah separate this as two items on a long enumerated list when they're identical? Rav Chizda, hadas shota. Hadas shota means when you have, right now, let's go with the opposite. A hadas that's kosher for lulav has to have 3 leaves that come from the same exact point. If you have 2 leaves and then below it a 3rd leaf, even a small amount, that's called a hadas shota. And what Nehemiah Hanavi is trying to emphasize to us is that you don't need a hadas kosher for the Daled meaning for Succah. You can have a hadas shota, which is disqualified for the Daled meaning. You can't use it for the lulav, but it's kosher for Succah. So that's why he uses a double language, which is not a repetition because it's referring to 2 different categories of hadasa. Rav Chizda, hadas shota l'sukkah, the eitz avos l'lulav. The pasuk is giving you, Nehemiah is giving you 2 recommendations: one for the sukkah, meaning for the schach, and the other for the lulav, for the mitzvah l'kachtem lachem. When he uses the term alei hadas, alei hadas is a reference to a general category of hadassim, which includes even hadas shota. But when he uses the term eitz avos, then he's talking about what we call mishulashim, which are kosher for the mitzvah of lulav. Once again, I wanted to refer to a footnote here in the art scroll number 12, if you have it. He says both the hadas and the eitz avos mentioned in this verse are species of the myrtle tree. They're both hadas. The reference to hadas is to hadas shota. Okay, fine. Mishnah, chavile kash. We have bundles of straw. Chavile eitzim, bundles of wood. Vechalvile zradim. Rashi has a long discussion here about what zradim are. If you take a look at Rashi, and it's the first Rashi on the Mishnah, and he says, min kanim. Kanim are what we call in English cane, not with a K, with a C. She'osim zradim, v'ovdim osam. Uba'odam lachim, while they're still moist, we feed them to the animals, these sprouts of cane. Behema ochlasam. Ulachi yavshu, and after they dry, omdim lehesek, then we use them as firewood. And the Mishnah paskins with regard to these 3 categories, ein mesachim. But now, why ein mesachim? L'chora, all the 3 mentioned materials are, number 1, gidula min haaretz, and number 2, it's eino makabel tuma. Why then does the Mishnah exclude it? And the answer to this has to do with what's called a gzera d'Rabbanan. And the key word here in the Mishnah is the word chavile, which repeats itself all 3 times. Chavile are a group of, let's say you take 25 canes or pieces of straw, and you tie them together in a bundle. Do you know what I mean when I say a haystack? Does that mean anything to you? Oh, it does. Okay, good. So it's like a haystack. And the Rabbanan were afraid that if we let you use a tied up haystack as sukkah, as schach, and that's after you dry it, then he may decide to use something which is actually pasul midoraisa. And what is that? Shema yanichem al tfanos hasukkah mitzad litzad veliyavsham v'achar kach yimloch b'daito lehosirom sham litzorach schach. Now watch what happens. This is engineering. No, I have a summary of Rashi which is called Masechet. So whenever I quote to you from Masechet, It's a summary, a rewriting of Rashi. When he adds other commentaries, it's in the footnotes on the bottom. And again, I would always encourage everyone to buy a Masechet. It's just worth the investment. It's 1,000 times better than art school.
Really?
Yeah, ain't a dome.
Like lesser.
Yeah, but no, it's okay. If you have art school, don't feel uncomfortable. I'm just telling you, if I could have any influence on you, I would tell you to buy, if you can afford it, buy Masechet. It's an amazing experience. Anyway, let's just explain what Masechet is telling us. And this is all based on Rashi. What you have is things that grow in nature, but they're very moist. And if you want to use them as firewood, because keep in mind, that's how they heated up their homes in those days. So you have to dry it out. The best way to dry it out is if you have, let's say, 2 vertical poles, or in our context, let's say 2 definos of the sukkah. And what you do is you stretch it from one side to the other, and the sun beats down on it. That schach, if let's say after it dries, he decides, you know what? I'm going to leave it there. I got built-in schach. The only problem is that the reason I put it up is to dry it. I didn't put it up with the initial intention that it should be a schach. Schach equals, what's my English word for schach? Shade. S-H-A-D-E. It's a shady business, right? That's what schach is. So if we would allow you to use bundles of these kinds of wood, then you might think, you know what? I'm going to take my bundle of wood when it's been cut down from wherever it was cut and it's still wet. I'm going to stretch it across my sukkah. That's a great place to dry it in the sun. And then I'm going to leave it there in schach. So the bundles themselves, which he put up for the purpose of shade, those are kosher. But the Rabbanan were afraid that if we let you use these bundles, then tomorrow you're going to take bundles and you're going to put it up there for the purpose of drying it. Or if not bundles, then you're going to take individual pieces. And then ultimately, after it dries, you're going to tie it up. And then you're going to say to yourself, you know what? This is perfect stock. I got built-in stock. Why do I got to go down to the, to the local, store here and buy stock? I'll just simply, I got my stock built in. I'm going to save myself a bomb of money.
Can't you have a kavanah beforehand?
Halavad. If you had a kavanah before, the chacham would not have made xera. But the problem with the Rabbanan is that they are afraid that people make confuse. They confuse. They make mistakes. This is so similar. If you look at it on the outside, you don't see the difference between someone who put the bundles up for the purpose of shade and Yankel, who put the bundles up for the purpose of drying it out in the sun. It looks identical. And that's what they did, was that when they dried these wood, this 3 different types of wood that we mentioned, they would tie it up in bundles. And now he's got stuff that he put up there as what? As drying, for the purpose of drying, and he's using it as schach. The Rabbanan were afraid he would now fall into a pit in which he uses schach that's possible with the rice.
A thing where people, they have schach all year round on their sukkah, and then before sukkahs they lift it up and they say
oh, I see. Well, that has to do with Beit Shammai. Question is, why are we machmir for Beit Shammai? But one thing I have to guarantee you, that even if they put it up, let's say, for example, we have in my house in Harnof, we have a pergola, and we put up something on top of the pergola. We put it there for the purpose of shade. It's not something wet that we want to dry in the sun. And once I put it up as shade, then it's schach. The fact that I use it, 359 days out of the year for shade, that doesn't undermine the status of schach. But your case, where you pick it up, put it down, that's going to come up in the very next line in the Gemara. So if you want to hold on for that.
In other words, he's putting it up to dry it, not for schach. That's why it's possible.
That's the case that's possible, though, right? The case of the Mishnah is he put it up as schach, and the Rabbanan said it's possible. Because the Rabbanan said it looks identical to the case of someone because it's wrapped up in bundles that put it up for the sake of drying.
If you unwrapped it, made it look different.
It would seem that since it's only possible to Rabbanan, that which Mendel said before is not necessary. Mendel's case is a case where he did not put it up for schach. Then he's got to pick it up and put it down again. In our case, he put it up as schach. The Rabbanan puzzled it because it's in bundles. All he has to do is remove the knots, remove the rope. Why? Because when it comes to the Rabbanan, a psul Rabbanan does not come under what we're going to learn about today, and that's called tasav v'lo. So hold off. Okay. V'kulon, here's the answer to Dr. Rubin's question. Kishi tiran ksheros. As long as he loosens the binding rope around them, then you have schach koch. Gemara is going to ask why the word v'kulon is here. Okay, fine. Then it says v'kulon sheros l'dfanos. You can take anything that's tied up in bundles and use it for defanos. Why? Because that requirement that we have with regard to sukkah is only with regard to schach, not with regard to defanos. Again, there's a long discussion here, but I just don't think we're going to make it on time. So I apologize for that. The Gemara says, Rabbi Yaakov, Shamis mi named the Rabbi Yochanan Tarta. I heard from my Rebbe Rabbi Yochanan 2 explanations for 2 different dinim, and I'm not sure which explanation is appropriate for which din. This is what we used to call as children matching. You remember matching? You know, you got 2 lists, and now we don't know how to match it. Chada ha, one explanation I heard with regard to this din of the psul of chavilos. Chavilos means if it's tied up in a bundle. Be'idach, and another explanation I had for the Mishnah on Daf Esvav, which we haven't learned yet. 3 blot from now, the Mishnah says, "Achoteit begadish lasos lo sukkah, eno sukkah." A man has a gadish. A gadish is a large haystack, and what he does is he digs into the haystack, and he makes a vacuum, an empty space inside the haystack, and now he's got schach on top of the area that he edged out, that he dug out, right? And the Mishnah says, Eino sukkah. That's not a sukkah. And for these 2 dinim, Rabbi Yochanan gave us 2 explanations. Chada, one explanation is Michum Gzeras Otzar, that this is a Gzera Chachamim. The Chachamim passed the sukkah. And the reason for that is because they felt if they would be machshir the sukkah, and even though it was a sukkah l'shem tzel, they might confuse this with something called an otzar. An otzar is something that you use for storage purposes, and it's not used for tzel, as we'll see. Ado, he gave another explanation. Mishum taseh v'lo mina osi. The Torah says, Chag HaSukkos taseh lecha. You need an active creation of a sukkah, and not a sukkah that is created by itself without the action. The emphasis here is on the word tasa. Says Rabbi Yaakov, Lo yadanu haiminayu mishum otzar, v'haiminayu mishum tasa v'lo min asli. Which of these 2 reasons belongs to which of the 2 dinim? We have 2 dinim, one in our Mishnah, one in the Mishnah on Daf Tesvav. In our Mishnah, we have the din of chavile, etc., meaning bundles. In the next Mishnah, we have the case of choteit begadish. And now we have 2 explanations. One is the D'Rabbanan Mishum Otzar, and one is the Doraisa, which disqualifies the schach on a Doraisa level because of Tasav v'lo min asli. And I don't know which of the 2 belongs to which one. And now the Gemara is going to quote Rabbi Yirmiyah to say there's a simple explanation in Rabbi Yochanan. I don't understand, Rabbi Yaakov, why you're racking your brains on something that's so simple, so straightforward. Let's see how we can interpret the words of Rabbi Yochanan. Now, keep in mind that Rabbi Yaakov never knew about this statement of Rabbi Chia. But the Gemara thought, Rabbi Yaakov certainly knew about Rabbi Chia, so I don't know why he had a question here, why he vacillated. Yom Rabbi Chia bar Abba Rabbi Yochanan, mipnei ma omru chavile kash v'chavile eitzim v'chavile ezra demei mesachechim b'hem. Why does our Mishnah disqualify for schach, bundles of straw, etc.? And the answer was because pa'amim adam shadam pa'amin asada be'eretz. A man comes home during the summer months, V'chavilaso al ksefo, and he's got a bundle of moist konim. Konim again, we said with those cane. Umale, and he puts it up on top of his sukkah. Meinichal gabi sukkaso kedei liyavsha, so that it'll dry in the sun. And then v'nimlach aleo, later on, after it dries, he changes his mind and he says instead of taking it down and designating it for storage so that it could use it in the future for firewood now that it's dry, he decides, what the heck, I might as well leave it up on top of my sukkah. L'sichu. And a Torah Amra tasav lo min asu. In other words, the psul d'oraisa here would apply, again, not in our case. Our case, he put it up l'shem sale. But what we're worried about is pa'amim. Pa'amim, this is the scenario that we have to worry about, where the schach would be pasul d'oraisa. Again, when he put it up l'shem sale, it's kosher d'oraisa. But since it's in bundles, the Rabbanan are going to pasul it because they're afraid of the following scenario, which would be a psul d'oraisa. Does everybody have that?
Yeah, I don't understand, but why is it tassel?
Oh, why is it tassel?
He put it up.
No, but he put it up and it wasn't schach. It became schach afterwards when he changed his mind and nimlach aleim. What you need, correct, his intention divides in schach. That's why the Mishnah later on, with the famous Mishnah of Tezvav that we were referring to of Tassel and Nasi, says Eina Sukkah. It's not schach. You know, we look at schach as a mitzvah, as a physical reality. But schach is a legal entity. And as a legal entity, schach requires l'shem sale. If he didn't have l'shem sale, when he changes his mind, he's creating schach, but it's already up on his sukkah. And that's called tasav lo min asu. Midaha mishum gzeres otzar, ha mishum tasav lo min asu. Meaning that now we can use what's called the process of elimination. Like if you have a matching 2 on the left column and 2 on the right column, how many do you actually have to match up? I mean, using your mind, only one. Because once you match up this one, you know that the other one is the other one. So since Rabbi Yochanan attached explicitly, as he was quoted by Rabbi Chia, the psul in our mission of chavilos, to the Gzera D'Rabbanan, we know ipso facto that with regard to the Doraisa, which is the Mishnah later on of Hachotet Begadish, that must be a psul of Tasev V'lo Min Asui, and it's a psul Dorais. And by the way, you should know that this whole discussion here is not theoretical. It's very, very relevant. Because when you talk about a psul D'Rabbanan, then we have principles like Sofik D'Rabbanan L'Kula, we might be making a lenient in a Mokum Hefsei, and so forth and so on. But when you're dealing with a psul Doraisa, there's nothing to talk about. So that when you're Chotet Min HaGadich, you dig out into a Gadich, that sukkah is psula d'oraisa. And that's what Rabbi Yochanan meant to say when he applied the principle of tasav lo min asu. But the bundles, which he put up l'shem blood, everybody, l'shem tzel, those are kosher d'oraisa. The Rabbanan are afraid of a case where in a similar kind of bundle, you had put it up on the schach, on the top as schach, but not schach min Torah, but rather l'shem yibush. And then you decided that it's going to be your schach. And that's a psul d'oraisa of tasav lo min asu. Rabbi Yaakov, why did Rabbi Yaakov vacillate about this point? Hach, the Rabbi Chia bar Abba lo shmile, he did not hear this tradition of Rabbi Chia bar Abba. Amar Rav Ashi, the Gemara is going to ask now a kasha on Rabbi Yochanan. Otu chavile kash v'chavile eitzim. Our Mishnah, mishum gzeras otzer ika, mishum tasav lo min asu leko. Are you telling me that in the case of bundles of wood, we don't have a psul d'oraisa, and the whole entity here is only d'Rabbanan? How could that possibly be true? So again, we're talking about chavile kash, which we just interpreted as referring to a psul d'Rabbanan. It's a gzeras otzer, and therefore it's possible with Rabbanan, but not with the rice. There's no psul of tasav v'lo min asu. And Rav Ashi asked the following question: our Mishnah could be interpreted in a case where he put up the chaviles moros litzorech yibush. Who told Rabbi Yochanan that our Mishnah is addressing a scenario where he put up the chaviles moros for the purpose of tzel? That's not why he put it there. He put it there l'shem yibush. Now, if he put it there l'shem yibush, and now he changes his mind and he redesignates it as what? As l'shem tzel, then he's got a real psul doraisa of tasav lo min asur. Not only that, but bechote begadish mishum tasav lo min asur ika. Are you telling me that there's only a psul doraisa of tasav lo min asur, but mishum gzeras otzar leka? And on a drabanan level, there's no psul of gzeras otzer. We could actually interpret the Mishnah in a different context. That after he took the what's called the omrim. How do you say omrim in English? Stacks, yeah, sheaves, stacks. So he took the omrim, and there were omrim on the bottom. And what he did was sasar eskol hagadish klape mala. Again, this is a summary of Rashi. Sasar eskol hagadish klape mala. Vinanea vininua l'shem tzel. And maybe he shook it l'shem tzel. So this is really good. What does he do? He digs out from the gadish, and then he shakes it for the purpose of tzel. If anyone could help me with this technology, it doesn't work for me. I can't seem to figure out how to mute somebody. There should be a picture of a little red picture of a microphone. I can't find it.
Sometimes all those function.
Okay, I don't see it now. It's all right. So again, maybe it was a case where somebody dug out the gadish, and then what they did was they shook the top layer of schach, what was left after the chatita, and they shook it for the purpose of tzel. In this case, there would be no psul doraisa of tasav lo min asur. It would only be possible rabbanan because of gzeras otza. So how do you know that the case of chotet begadish is a case where you didn't do a nanua, where you didn't shake it, and therefore it's a psul doraisa? Maybe it's a case where he actually shook the schach for the purpose of tzel, and therefore the only psul would be a psul d'Rabbanan. So the Gemara answers, Rabbi Yochanan is going to tell you that I read the Mishnah carefully. And what the Mishnah says is the following: Ein misachachim b'hem. If you look at our Mishnah carefully, the Mishnah says, let's go back to our Mishnah, and it says, Chavile kash, etc. Ein misachachim b'hem. And what does that mean? Ein misachachim b'hem. It doesn't say it's possible or eino sukkah. It says ein misachachim b'hem. Avoid it. And what does that mean? That means lechatchila hu. And now we turn to Yud Beis, Amid Beis. Technology here.